So much things to say right now. So much things to say. They got so much things to say right now. They got so much things to say. I'll never forget no way. I hate crucified Jesus Christ. I'll never forget no way. They saw mommy starting from right. I'll never forget no way. How they turned me out so awful. So now that you forget no way who you are and where you stand in the struggle. They got so much things to say right now. They got so much things to say. Yeah. So much things to say right now. They got so much things to say. I don't come to fight flesh and blood, but spiritual wickedness in high and low places. Oh, you find me though, I'll stand firm and get your own thanks and praises. I don't expect to be justified, no. I these laws are made. All the wicked find me guilty. I know, my innocence is when the rain falls and gone. All on wild man's outside. When the rain falls and gone. All on wild man's outside. They cry. So much things to say right now. There's so much things to say. They got so much things to say right now. So much things to say. Whatever you talking about, whatever you talking, none of them want it. Ain't none of them want it. Somebody steps down the plane. I've been walking. I've been walking. So let me get talking. No. Excuse me. I know hey. Hey, how was your vacation?
Do you mind if I sit here, honey? I want to get my head out of my big old head out of the camera. Right enough. You can sit here too, Randy. Okay. I'm just afraid that's like.
I have to say that.
So no one will sit on Can I sit there and just relax? Sit right there. Yeah, but your head's very hard. I think she's staying there. You're so busy. Thanks for all your help.
This is called getting out of your comfort zone. Sitting on the front row.
Your old me can't be a water bottle. I know. I just
You know what? Yeah, that's all right, y'all. We here. Welcome back to the People's African History class. Thank y'all so much for being here. Let's see. Oh, so if anybody or you know anybody that receives SNAP benefits, the organization outside has a free lunch voucher for today. So all you have to do is just go outside for the free lunch voucher, fill out a survey, and then you can get lunch for today. So that's available for you or anybody that you know. So feel free to access that. Thank y'all so much for being here. I see about half faces I've seen before, and then some new faces. So it's always good to see family, and then some new folks that's about to be family. Thank y'all so much for being here. Again, as you know, this is the People's African History class. We do this every first and third Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. And so here, myself through our organization, Ashe Institute, LLC, we are here and we offer these classes for free. They're free and open to the public. As you know, a lot of the Black history is being taken out of our schools, being sanitized in our schools. And so this is what we have available to our children, but not only our youth, but anybody who wants to come in and just learn. I know Saturdays can be a busy day. Sometimes we use those days to run errands or family time, so you don't have to come. You know, we want you to come every Saturday, you don't have to, but it's just free and open. So you come, you know, there's no pressure or anything like that. But all we ask is that you spread the word so that more and more people know, and more and more people know that this is available and this is something we're doing right here at Cafe Resistance. Shout out to Cafe Resistance for having us here. We just be very happy to be here. I think that is it. Also, please make sure you sign here, Seth. You wanted the job to do here, brother. Pass this around so everybody can sign. He love to be a part and do stuff. So here, have everybody sign this. Well, this is people who are already here. So you can go around and have everybody sign the sign-in sheet, the email list, so that you know when the classes are going to be. If you've already signed it, then you're good. If you're already getting the emails, you're good. But if you haven't, please sign up so that you can get the email blast, so that you know what we're doing and what's happening every first and third Saturday. So thank you for being here. We'll go ahead and get started. As you know, I like to do this intro to let people know what this is all about. For those of you who are new, this is called the People's African History class, and what we mean by the people is that it is for everybody. It is for us, not us, for Black folks. But anybody can be a part and learn from each other through discussion and sharing of knowledge of African and African American history and African history worldwide. And it's not just for some people It's for everybody. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, it doesn't matter where you're from. You could be light, dark, from the north, from the south, from the city, from the country, rich, poor, gay, straight. It doesn't matter, man, woman, whatever. This is history for all of us, right? And so this is what it is all about. It's a collective learning process, meaning, yes, I'm here to facilitate a discussion. Yes, I'm here to talk about African history worldwide. And I use the knowledge of my background to provide information. But there's some things that you know that I don't know. Some things that I know that you don't know. Some things that you all can learn from each other. So if you've been here, you know, I like to keep it open. I like to have discussions. I like for us to have discussions. Sometimes we get into debates, healthy debates over certain topics, and that's okay because that's how we learn. So we're all learning from each other, and the purpose of this knowledge is to uplift us all, to uplift our community, to have something in our community that is for us, where we control our narrative, and we control how it's being taught, and what we're learning, and what kind of knowledge that we pass down to our children. We are learning about Black history from Africa to the United States and all around the world. So that is the type of history that we are learning. Not just Black American, right? Not just Afro-Caribbean, but we are talking about the African diaspora, African people across the world. Many people have asked me in the past, hey, how can we donate? How can we contribute? How can we help advance this through dollars? And so I created a Cash App, so feel free to scan that. I have it up here in the front, and then I also have it at the very end. If you want to send any type of donation, all the donations go to the organization to help us advance this cause and other causes like that. So, with that being said, don't forget to sign the sign-in sheet that we have. My nephew is coming around with that. So usually I have either some young people, my nephew or my daughter, sometimes will be out there. So I try to get with them and also coming around. We have my other nephew there with the clicker. So this is a family event. I slide the family something. Yeah, it's a family event. So that's what's happening over here. Again, feel free to share the knowledge that you have with the group. Also know that when we cover topics, I can't cover everything, right? When we go over topics, obviously our history is very bad. History itself is very bad. So there might be some things that I might miss. If there's something that I don't cover or something I don't talk about, feel free to jump in. Say, hey, did you know this part of whatever I'm talking about, or that part, and we'll talk about it. So feel free to jump in. This is a collaborative effort. The last time we were here, we talked about the West African empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And so we talked about them because these were the last kingdoms, the last of the West African kingdoms, right before the slave trade, right? And so, so far we've been talking about African history from the very beginning of time, all the way up until where we are now with Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. We talked about how these African kingdoms flourished, how powerful they were, and specifically Mali, which Mali produced one of, if not the most wealthiest person ever in history, which was who? Does anybody know? Mansa Musa, right? They say that if they were to calculate his wealth in today's currency, it would be about $400 billion, right? So that's about how much he was worth. So the wealthiest man in history pretty much gave a lot of it away, pretty much brought down the whole worth of gold in the North African area just because he gave it all away as he was looking to make his Hajj to Mecca. And eventually he gave it all up to serve Allah for the rest of his life. We ended with the Empire of Songhai, which was the last of the West African empires right before the Europeans came into West Africa in large numbers, and then the slave trade started to begin, and that is where we are today. We're going to be talking about the beginnings of the slave trade. So we'll start today, and maybe for about the next, maybe like 2 or 3 weeks, we'll talk about that. We'll actually have a guest speaker on the first Saturday in December, then I'll be back on the 3rd, and then from there we'll continue with slavery and talk about that, and then going into freedom and the whole African American history path. So we're going to do that for the next couple of weeks. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, I'm brought up on that with West Africa. I'm curious how much how much it's changed when we're looking at from what you're talking about. Like Ghana and Mali, are they still represented today as if they were, the lines have been all redrawn
Absolutely.
by colonizers and stuff, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think when we're going to get to that.
Oh, it's okay. I just
Yeah, because there is a map I'm going to show you.
Oh, good.
Prior to colonization, what the African maps look like. I'm trying to think, but then if you like Google, you'll see what the actual map
Yeah,
looks like.
I should have put that in like then.
Yeah. But I have the map that's actually really interesting. I'm going to show y'all. I just don't remember which slide it's on, but it's going to come up in.
That's cool. Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So again, this was where we left off last class. Chinua Achebe in his book Things Fall Apart, very famous African text, Nigerian text, pretty much about the onset of the slave trade and how it affected many parts of Nigeria. And what he said was that the white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. He has put a knife on the things that held us together, and we have fallen apart. So that's kind of where we will have our jumping off point in terms of the lesson today. So the takeaway that I want you to have here, again, I always like to start with a takeaway because I know people may have to leave or something like that. So I'm going to take a picture or just write this down. The takeaway is that the transatlantic slave trade was the forced movement of an estimated 10 to 12 million African people. That's a very conservative number. Many numbers say it's probably about 30 to 40 million African people. To the Americas between the 15th and the 19th century. Enslaved Africans were kidnapped, transported across the Atlantic in brutal conditions known as the Middle Passage, and forced to work in the Americas. This trade created generational wealth for European and American powers, devastated African societies, and established a racial hierarchy that exists and persists today. So we're going to go more into that topic now. So the first thing I want to talk about is some of the deconstruction and misconceptions that have occurred when it comes to discussing the transatlantic slave trade. So a couple of deconstruction and misconceptions that we have about the slave trade. One is that African people sold other Africans into slavery, right? That's one of the things that we have heard over and over again. And technically, yes, that is true, right? In order for the slave trade to occur, there had to be some exchange and some negotiation with many of the kings and many of the leaders of certain villages, right? However, the idea of what that looked like, it did not exist in the way that we understand it today. Why is that considered a misconception, the idea that African people sold other African people into slavery?
Well, first of all, the chiefs didn't understand what slavery would look like in the Americas. Okay? That was their first problem. So they thought that when people were captured from other tribes, even within their tribes, that when they were exchanged to the whites or Portuguese, whoever they were, that they were doing an exchange for goods, trinkets, if you will, but they could not fathom that slavery would look the way it turned out to look. You know what I'm saying? When they gave their people away. So in that exchange, you could be an indentured servant. I think what the chiefs had in mind.
Right.
I don't know, but in their mind, slavery would not have been as bad as it turned out to be.
Right. The idea of slavery was not new in the ancient world, right?
Correct.
It dated back since the early beginnings of time, right? Where you would exchange people and their labor for goods, right? So if you needed something or wanted something and you didn't necessarily have any goods, what that other country needed or wanted, it wasn't uncommon for you to trade 500 of your best men, 600 of your best men. Typically, that would happen. They would typically have some of the smartest, some of the most intelligent, some of your biggest and strongest soldiers or men or women to help build up your country or your kingdom. So that wasn't an uncommon thing, right? And there were also rules of engagement and rules when it came to, like you said, indentured servitude or slavery. It wasn't chattel slavery how we understand it today. It was simply, you take these goods, we'll take your people. Oftentimes it was for a limited amount of time. It may be 10 years, it may be 15 years. And then your people would then come back, right? There wasn't this idea of a person being less than human. You were treated fairly. Oftentimes, after you worked a certain amount of years, then you would actually, depending on if it was your choice, you would be integrated into that system, integrated into that society, and be one of those people. You would be a citizen, right? So there were all of these. There was a different idea around what this was, right? It was not as inhumane as many of these African people thought it was going to be, right? So that was one aspect of this misconception. So a lot of times when we hear this, African people sold other African people into slavery, it's very important for when we hear this to make sure that we contextualize it properly. In addition to that, oftentimes African people did not consider themselves selling each other into slavery. Because if, let's say, I'm from one tribe, right, and this sister's from another tribe, and we've been at war with each other for the past 50, 100, 200 years, right? And we've been going to war with each other for a long time. And then here comes this European comes and say, hey, if you capture them and sell them to me, we'll give you guns, or we'll give you gold, or we'll give you sugar, or whatever. Well, we've been at war with each other for so long, I don't see this person as my brother or my sister. They've been my enemy for 200 years. So it's not a problem, right? And in the same way, it was the same way between the French and the British and the Portuguese, right? It was the same in the Spanish and the Germans. They didn't see each other as white, just like we all didn't see each other as black. Because the whole continent was black. All of Europe was white, so it wouldn't make sense to see each other as the same. Now, in a post-racial, I want to say post-racial world, in a racialized context, now we all may look at each other and say, oh, we're all black, or we're all white, or we're all Asian. But that's after the concept of race has already been now instilled and introduced into our world understanding. So I think we also have to understand how these people look at each other, and not just how they look at each other, but how individuals look at each other. The idea of race didn't exist at that time, so they didn't see themselves as selling each other into slavery.
Oh, no.
Oh, I thought you had your hand.
Thanks.
All right, cool. Couple other misconceptions. African people were not slaves, right? In America, they were indentured servants. Initially, like you said, sister, that's what we thought was happening, right? We thought that this was indentured servitude, but no, this absolutely was enslavement. It was chattel slavery, and these people were treated as less than human. And so, if you have a book where your children go to a school and the teacher says this is absolutely false, right? So these people were. Now they're trying to take this out of the books and say, oh, well, they weren't really slaves. They were servants, and they weren't treated that bad. Slavery wasn't that bad. Look at how they had churches and they praised God, and look at how they were praying and how they were celebrating and things like that. Look at the culture that they built because of this. So we were just helping them create culture. That's absolutely not true, right? We created culture. We created the Black church. We created the Black family. We created the things that we created in spite of our situation. It did not contribute and help our situation, right? So that speaks more to our power than it does their goodness. So it's very important that we recognize that these are actual misconceptions that have been taught in our school that I'm sure you may have heard. I know that I've heard, and that's why it's important for us to break these things down. And lastly, this idea that Black people just accepted their fate, right? They got captured, they were caught, they were enslaved, and they just sat there and waited around till somebody freed them. Absolutely not true. From the time that we got here, we was running. From the time we got here, we were fighting. From the time we got here, we were resisting, and we've been resisting ever since. Hence why we are in a place called Cafe Resistance. Okay? We've been doing it for a very long time, and we continue to fight, and we continue to live a life of resistance and struggle. All right, go ahead, Janelle. Right. Again, a lot of this stuff has been institutionalized, put into our textbooks, put into our schools. The teachers that teach this stuff have not been properly trained, do not properly understand history in general, let alone African and African American history. And so that's why understanding these things contextually is important. Also, I want to say, just while we talk about the slave trade and we talk about enslavement, it's also very important that we don't absolve African people from their responsibilities, right? They still had to work within a lot of the African rulers and kingdoms and things like that in order to get this accomplished. So in no way am I saying that there was not a hand that Black people played in, right? We're going to tell the truth. We're going to tell the whole truth. We're going to tell what we've done good, the bad, the ugly, the right, and wrong, so that we know how to not make these same mistakes again. And so we will go into that part as well. Before we get into the topic of, go deeper into the topic of the slave trade, one of the things I do want to discuss is this whole idea of race and racial categories. When we think about race, what is race and how is race defined in our world? What is race and how is race defined? Go ahead.
This is like our attributes of who we are, and it's really defined like our skin color or where we come from.
Okay. So race is defined by our attributes, our skin color, where we come from. What kind of attribute do we connect to race? Physical, right? Like what? Like
hair,
hair,
facial, whatever,
facial structure, skin, hair, nose, lips, all of these things, right? And then how do we define race in the world we live in today? How is it defined? How is it categorized?
Well, on forms, it's black, white, Hispanic,
Yes.
non-Hispanic. So it's a categorization, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but once you answer that, you're pigeonholed pretty much into whatever the larger community thinks about those categories. Okay? So there is a social construct in place here. You know what I'm saying? Somebody else, well, the monkey months is what I call it. They have been defined race as a category. And so they push you in that category. And if you fit, you fit. If you answer the questions and that's what they want to see, you're kind of like discriminated against. So I think the social construct in our institutions, especially our schools, and any other place, corporate America, the medical field, it kind of defines who others have felt that these people are.
So I don't mean to be fey or naive, but
Say your question.
I'm wondering, like, do you think it's appropriate to continue calling this Black history when we are partners in it? I mean, where does it become our history, and why don't we stop calling it Black history and make white America, make everyone else acknowledge their part? And I think when we keep saying Black history, it's like, okay, you guys go on.
Well, first of all, we cannot force Black history or the changing of Black history on the majority. You know what I'm saying?
No, I don't.
All we can do is educate, first of all, where we are and seek to educate the larger or the broader community.
Right.
But we've gotten pushback on that.
Yeah. I mean,
Look at what they're trying to do in Florida.
I mean, I acknowledge that. I understand that. But I think, it's almost giving white people a pass, like that's them. That's their story. But we are so integral
I
to
get
this.
it. It's our story. It's America's story.
I agree.
And the world story.
But words matter. And I think calling it something gives white people this kind of,
Well,
So
I
I'm just
think-
curious about the language.
I think it's interesting, right? Because if that's the case, then should there be a pushback in school when our students have to take a class called American History, right? Because American history, yes, it is the history of America, but the history of America is also British history. There's so much French history in America. There's so much African history in America. And so having to individualize a perspective on history is nothing wrong with that. However, I think the way in which we accompany it, the way in which we see it and approach it should be different. So, for example, in class, in high school, I had to take an AP European history class. And we had no problem taking the European history class because we understood the European influence on the world and the world's influence on Europe. So that wasn't a problem, right? If you have to take a Latin American history class, there's nothing wrong with that because there are these influences of the world on Latin American history and vice versa. And so in the same way, you have this perspective of teaching African and African American history, that is no problem calling it that. However, the issue is what you said, I think, in the latter part of your question, which is when people hear it, particularly when white people hear it, they automatically distance themselves from it, as opposed to if an American were to hear, hey, my child is going to get an AP European history course. Well, absolutely, you should learn that. But you're not European, so why in the world would you feel that your child would be okay in taking that kind of course? So I think it's the mindset of people when they hear a certain history and not necessarily those people taking their name out of their history, right? We should see the value in learning everybody's history, whether it's called African history, European history, Asian, whatever. And those people who are teaching that history, having the say-so and having the knowledge, being pundits of that history, being able to teach that history properly. And I think if we do that, I think having that name and appreciating that name and having people accept it, I think would be a better approach. Yes, sir.
Well, to be honest, from my perspective, brought about institutionalizing like the history of schools. I'm gonna tell you, man, the people's African history class that you have learn more in an hour than what you're talking about than learn in public school, any kind of so-called African American history and a whole semester, certain amount of years. I think it's a waste of time. I think that what Black people should do is just go to the internet and they can learn all the history they want. And I wrote down just a couple of people, not at school myself, story. But hey, Dr. Gerald Horn, Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Asa Hilliard, look at any of those lectures and you learn a whole lot more. But for the schools, to me, something relevant would be to put like Swahili as a language course next to Chinese classes that they have at Reebok Middle School. They have Chinese, Spanish, French, or any of these, this type of language. I just want to mention some years ago, a substitute taught in some schools. And I remember going out to Rehall Middle School, all black, right? And I substitute taught for a Chinese class. It just so happened on that particular day, it was like a half day situation. And the students were at some kind of like program, so they didn't actually come to the classes. So the 2 periods that I was in the classroom, I was just there, and I observed around the room. So you go around the room and you see Chinese language class. You see things with architecture. You see pictures of food dishes, dance structures, like geography in terms of maps of China. So just studying about language includes all facets of any people, descriptions, customs, culture, and everything involved. So in terms of a language class, if black people want to learn about themselves and whatever perspectives, they could learn a lot through just peaceful healing, because you cannot separate the language from the geography, the origin source, the word source, the customs and culture. Just like last time you were here, I pointed out that the Jenga game right here, still right there in the corner, is a Kiswahili name. So that was just my thought, in general from what I see. So anybody have any comments on that? I know that might be controversial, what I just said.
No, absolutely right. I think that is why these names are significant. I think that's why it's important for us to understand that even if you talk about a specific kind of history, it does not absolve or mean that, this is for them, it's not for us, and vice versa, regardless of, where a person is from. Okay? Actually, you know what? Go back. Sorry. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of race is that there is no biological basis to race, right? A lot of times, raise your, okay, I want to ask this question. I typically ask this to my students. Raise your hand if you think that you can, 100% of the time, you can look at somebody and tell what race they are. 100% of the time. 99%. A lot of, and we've all done it, right? Maybe you meet somebody and you kind of look at it and you like, hey. And so you may listen and wait for certain cues to see if they say, oh yeah, okay, she back. All right, cool. Let me see what it, because you have, right, in terms of race, in terms of race can be very ambiguous, right? Race can be very ambiguous. I got one of my homeboys. We grew up together. He's more darker brown skin, but his mom and dad is light skin, and his brother light skin. So we used to always joke with him. You might want to check and see, you know what I'm saying? Whatever was happening back in the day. But when it comes to genetics and biology, things don't always look the way we think they should look, right? And so you can't go to every single person just because they look a certain way, or their hair is a certain way, or whatever the case is, it doesn't mean that they would be of that race. So essentially, when biologists break this whole thing down, what they found, we don't have time to look at that link, but what they found is that we have more in common genetically than we have in terms of differences. And actually, if you put people of various racial groups inside of a place, and if you were to cut us all open, right, and break us down to our DNA level, what you will find is that 2 people of different races may actually have more in common genetically than 2 people of the same race, right? And so, for example, I would identify as Black. I imagine you would identify as Black. But let's say you might identify as white. But if you were to open us up, you actually may have more in common with her biologically than me, which lets us know that biologically, when it comes to race really doesn't exist. Race is a social construct. Race is something that was created by humans to categorize us into groups so that then we can be placed on a hierarchy of who has this or who has that, or who is would be more likely to be in leadership, or who would be a better leader, or who would be better at this, or who would be better in a subservient position. These were things that was created, and in fact, the idea of race as a construct is actually one of the newer constructs, right? And if you look at race, gender, and class, right, the three major ones, right? And so if you look at race, gender, and class, race is only maybe about 500, 600 years old, as opposed to gender and class, which goes all the way back to the beginnings of time. So this is a very new construct that has no real biological basis. And so I think it's important for us to understand that this all started with the onset, kind of sort of, we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but it really started with the onset of the era of the slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade. I actually wanted to go ahead because I saw this.
I wanted to just say that some people may have difficulty about being based on certain neurological and also biological constructs. The people that we know as black people, we actually have neuromelanin as the basis of who they are. The neuromelanin is something that's very intriguing scientific. You see, about structures. Everybody has melanin. It's that substance is black, intelligent. Actually, melanin is without melanin, you wouldn't have life because it is important to the human genome that melanin is present in order to have life. Now, the people, the so-called people called black people, have neuromelanin, and it's different from any other group of black people.
Okay, so I know what you're saying. You don't feel like race is thing social construct, but scientists, white ones and black ones, they all agree that the human homeland is in Africa. Right? So they go either to Tanzania or down in the Namibia area where the Khoisan people are. And they themselves, these are Europeans, say, okay, I'm home. Because Botswana and Namibia are where it all started. All right, so if we're going to say human homeland, human race, then that's going to be Bantu peoples in those areas. Okay, now if people who don't consider themselves of that lineage, then they can say, well, there's something else. But in terms of looking at from an ethno-cultural, ethno-racial standpoint, this is the race of people. But where things get muddy is if you say, if one says Bantu, African, and Caucasian, and Asian, that makes it more easy to just determine from a physical and a cultural standpoint. Now when you start throwing in somebody's race, and now you have Hispanic, a false idea of race, it's not even a race at all, then you start looking at people who are like from various backgrounds who are Caucasian, but then they'll say, well, I'm not white. White. Oh, I'm Caucasian. So then muddies the waters. And you got people who are Arab and other kind of people. And then they say, well, I'm Caucasian sometimes. I'm Middle Eastern. White. No, I'm not that. So the mix-up is that we're mixing ethnicity and race. And it's being done in a false sort of way. But if you broke it down to Bantu, Caucasian, and Asian, maybe you put Caucasian and Asian together and then find it is the way it is, then it will be very clear. Right now, let's just say States. Right now, the Arab peoples in the U.S. are saying they want to change their on paper designation from being up under white and Caucasian. And they're saying they want to be now classified on the census as Middle Eastern. And when their organizations are told as to why they want to do that, they're saying they don't benefit from being classified on paper as white because they might be discriminated against in a small town in the United States if someone finds out they're Muslim. So they said, well, okay, I might be considered white, but if somebody finds out my background, then being classified as white or Caucasian doesn't mean anything. So now I want to be classified as a minority to be a protected class. Right. This is what I'm talking about. So I do believe that people can be classified by race. And I think that the prevalent thing is that Black people here in this country don't want to be African.
That's a really good point. That's something that we have talked about in the past. The idea of should we classify ourselves as African or American, that kind of thing. And in terms of race, you're absolutely right, because which I think goes back to my point of why a lot of the ideas around race are socially constructed and oftentimes based on policies, because we don't even have to go back as far as you were talking about. But even if you go back to the Homestead Act of the 19th century, where to kind of provide some level of reparations for Native Americans, there was a certain amount of land that was allotted to Native Americans in order to help cultivate for themselves as a form of reparations for their mere extinction. And in order to do that, you had to prove that you were Native American, and you had large numbers of white Americans who essentially decided, oh, well, in order to get access to this land, I'm going to say that I'm Native American because there's 2% Native American or 5% Native American in my bloodline. And so I'm going to use that to help get access. So now, because I want this land, I'm going to say that I'm Native American. And it actually worked. And large numbers of white folks, particularly in the Midwest, were able to get land and keep land in their lineage and in their family line because they, for 1 second, decided that they were going to be Native American. But I think that, again, speaks to the idea of how race, a lot of times, is socially constructed and based on policy. And people can be allowed to move in and out of race whenever it fits. So this idea of race, I think, is important to first talk about before we go into the transatlantic slave trade, because there was no concept of race in the pre-colonial world, right? People did not capture and people did not enslave certain people based on the way that they looked, right? Typically, it wasn't that. Oftentimes, people may have been enslaved or brought into indentured servitude based off of whether they felt these people were civilized or barbarians. Greeks didn't necessarily say, oh, well, these people are barbarians because they're French or because they're Africans or because they're Spanish. If you were a non-Greek, it don't matter what color you were considered a barbarian. And that means if we attacked you, we were going to enslave you, period, right? It had nothing to do with race or color in that way. Slaves came from all backgrounds, right? There was no race or color assigned to enslavement. It didn't matter if you looked like them or you didn't look like them. So early ideas around racism didn't actually start with the notion of black and white or Africans and Europeans, but actually, try to get good help. Wake up. You give me the clicker. You sleep. I'm not going to sleep. You sleep. All right. So it didn't have to do with Africans and Europeans or black and white, but Christians and Jews, right? Christianity and Judaism. So early anti-Judaism, and this is in Europe, started during the time where Christians and Jews were at odds with each other. And so there was evidence of anti-Judaism that was found in the early Christian church. Why do you think many Christians had this animosity towards Jews? Because they persecuted Jesus, right? So because these Jews persecuted their founder, they had this animosity towards them. However, it wouldn't have been considered racism necessarily Because racism is when you see a group of people at their actual foundation being evil. Why could Christians not necessarily see Jews at their foundation as being a people that were inherently evil? Because the early foundation of Christianity is what? Judaism. And so because the early foundation of Christianity is Judaism, that means if we say that these people at their very foundation are inherently evil and unnaturally evil, then that means we are too, right? So that's why this could not necessarily be seen as racism itself, but this is some of the early times in where you actually see people of a different, if you want to call ethnic group or of a different group, being seen as having these, to a degree, natural, inherently evil ideas. So anti-Judaism was animosity towards Jewish history and beliefs, but oftentimes, if they could convert the Jew over to Christianity, they didn't have that animosity toward them anymore. It was simply based on their beliefs. But soon anti-Judaism began to transfer into anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is what we think about when we think about Hitler, right? Anti-Semitism was this consuming hatred of Jews that made getting rid of them preferable to conversion. So yes, we could convert them, right? Make them Christians, but it'll be a lot easier just to get rid of them, right? Just to make a totally different country, a totally different society, and rid ourselves of the evil that they bring. However, the idea of conversion was not completely out of the question because, again, there was this connection that Christians had with Jews. However, racism occurred once there was this belief by Christians that Jews were intrinsically evil, right? Again, we're going to take this back into the African and European contention in a second, but I just want you to see that this idea of racism didn't just pop up. The idea of race didn't just pop up. This was a slow burn. And this, we're talking about happening in maybe the 11th century. So it took another 500 years to go from these types of actions and this type of belief to actually getting to a point where people started to believe that another people were inherently evil. And it didn't start with Africans and Europeans. It didn't start with Black people and white people. It actually started with Christians and Jews.
Isn't that what's going on right now in the colleges? The issues that are going on in the colleges right now against the Jews?
Oh, right. With the Palestinian conflict.
Yes.
That is right. But it does come out of this tradition for sure. Absolutely. It's taken on different forms and evolved in a lot of ways. But it definitely comes out of this tradition. Yes.
So, right when you acknowledged my hand and flashed on that slide right there, first slide, first part of the sentence said capital Europe. And just from my reading, I want to just throw in this. People were saying, well, okay, Jews were disliked because the treatment of Jesus, but from my reading, it seems like it's more that the Roman Catholic Church, who was primarily the religion early on over what became the early states of Europe, they kind of put out that Jews were bad because they made it that Jews killed God because Jesus had been made God. So therefore, the idea that Jews rejected Jesus and allowed Pontius Pilate to say, okay, kill him, then the Roman Catholic Church put out the idea that Jews kill God. And therefore, all of these new states in Europe, known in different kind of languages and stuff, Hispanicus, Iberia, all these kind of names, they have a prejudice against Jews. So Jews have been running in different parts of Europe with one foot in one country and one foot outside of it. I just wanted to throw that out in case someone had some comments or you, Dr. Brand, about that.
piggyback off what you were saying. During the times when the Moors had went into Europe, there were Catholics, there were also Muslims, and there were Jews. So a lot of people that were Catholic, like the Serranos and the Grandes, these are the people that went to Cuba. This is Castro's family. He's actually a Serrano. If you look at, you see Castro, he has a star on him. You see a Jewish star, but they were Catholic at night and Jews they were Catholic in the day and Jews by night. You know, because that, you just say what he said, they've always had this hatred that started, and it was almost like a whisper. It wasn't like this grand thing where somebody came out, but it was these little whispers that started. Now, a lot of people who really were doing it in the daytime, they were doing this. You know what I mean? That's just to let people know that it was. I never really thought of it like that, but that is in a book that Dr. Don Henry Clark wrote. He talks about the Serranos and the Grandes being Christians in the daytime and Jews at night. Yes, sir. That was
And this text right here, where this information is coming from, again, you always like to give you sources, you can go back and read for yourself. This comes from a book called A Short History of Race by George Fredericks. So you can see how the idea of race and racism, where it started from, and how we understanding has a very long history. Like you were saying, it was very, very subtle in how these ideas of groups being intrinsically evil in nature, how it started from one group having different religious beliefs to actually people being of various racial groups. So, yeah. Yes.
I just want to say, like, I get the social construct piece because the complex part about this is looking at history with our modern framework in terms of how we live as modern day people compared to historical times. Because the role of race now has a different role present day than it did previously.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, when we think about, like, I identify as a Black woman, right? I understand that race is a social construct. Like, I'm a human being first. I realize that I live in the country of America. There's a lot of things that I acknowledge, but the reason that I identify as Black is because of our need for community. So we aren't tribal anymore, and there are different ways that we commune. And one of those is through our cultural similarities. And I'm able to identify people who are more similar to me than not via my racial identification. We also know that not all skin folk are kinfolk, and just because you look like me does not mean you are me. And we experience that when we talk about the diaspora. So when people are like, I don't want to identify as African, or I don't want to identify, like, if you are, Hispanic and you look like a Black person, you don't want to identify as a Black American. There's so many different layers as to why those things are. But I did want to go back to, your point earlier where you were saying, like, why isn't it like our history as opposed to being labeled as Black history? And for me, a big part of that is like authorship and who's going to tell that story. So when we start to broaden whose history it is, the perspective that history is coming from is going to shift because there is a European lens to what took place. There's an African lens that took place. There's the people who went through the transatlantic slave trade and what their perspective is on that issue. And then even when we start talking about, Christian and Jewish, I'm hearing the dialect there. My understanding of that is biblical. So my source of truth is the Bible. So in the Bible, I do understand that Jesus was Jewish and he was persecuted by, Jewish people, his people. And he came to be first the savior to those people, and they rejected him. And so then it became where more people who weren't identifying as Jewish were able to, receive salvation. But when we start to layer in, okay, like now there's the Catholic Church, and it becomes a very complicated narrative. And so I guess the question really is like when we start to talk about history, we don't all have the same source of truth. And so once we move away from whatever that starting point is, and we're all coming in at different pieces, it's really hard to kind of align us because race doesn't mean the same thing to everybody because we're all looking at it as like, is it what we're learning in terms of this truthful history, or is it like I'm a Black woman in 2025 and I live in Jacksonville, Florida, you know what I mean? And we're in the political climate we're in, and I understand why I need to be Black.
That's a really good point. Yes.
Go back to the previous slide and just ask the question about from the being I've done that Semites, that term extended beyond people who are of the Jewish faith. And also that people of the Jewish faith aren't Jews by race, but by faith. And so I'm trying to reconcile that with this progression of like anti-Semitism. Because in my mind, that's conscripted by the people of Jewish faith. Martyred as first, right? And also the idea that to be Jewish is to be of a certain race. Because as you said, race is a construct. I was just trying to reconcile how that progression went with the idea that race is a construct and that Semites, aren't necessarily just localized to people of the Jewish faith.
Right. And so when George Fredrickson talks about this, he's talking about this from that religious, right? Not now, even myself, this is my area of expertise in terms of Judaism racially versus Judaism from a faith-based standpoint. But I know when George Fredrickson talks about this, and he doesn't go into a whole lot of detail, I think it's like one chapter where he talks about this. But this is just to set us up for the differences between anti-whatever that those people are versus what racism is. And how racism is this idea of people being intrinsically and naturally evil based off of who they are, and that there cannot be a change. And so how he connects this is essentially saying this was the first time in history where we kind of saw this between two people, whether it be religion or whether it be ethnicity, like what you're talking about, Semites versus just these people of a certain faith, but how this concept of it then started to relate itself into the way in which Europeans interacted with African people. And that's kind of where we're going into then talking about it through the lens of like how it led to the transatlantic slave trade. Does that make sense?
And I think there's parallels to what she's saying with, I think, where you're going in the sense that once it went beyond its original meaning, so like to be Jewish initially was an ethnicity marker, and then it became a religious association. Similar, we're seeing that now when it comes to how we talk about our ethnicity, let's just say here in the States, because we live in the States. What it meant to be white at one point was what it meant to be white.
Correct.
Until we're now seeing sort of the traditional white population decline, and there's this new majority in terms of all these other ethnicities that are coming up. And now it's becoming more advantageous for that definition of what it means to be white to be expanded to the point we were talking about around why are Middle Eastern people associated as being white, or why is it that now, let's say I'm Asian and I marry a white man and my child looks white, it might be more advantageous for me to start leaning into a certain thing. And so I don't know, I don't want to point fingers at who's to blame for this, but there is a very similar parallel that's running alongside when it wasn't advantageous to be ethnically Jewish, nobody wanted to be Jewish. Then when it became advantageous to be religiously Jewish, everybody wanted to be Jewish. And then now like we're seeing it in other countries around, like Christianity is now becoming like persecutable. So it's the kind of what you were saying about during the daytime I'm this thing, but at my core I'm really this other thing. So, and I think that's the complexity part of it being a social construct is because it means it's always subject to change.
Exactly. However, we decide as a human race, however we decide what it looks like, even within that specific locale, right? When you talk about America or Europe or wherever, right? So let's see. I want to skip over. Okay. So initially, when Europeans began to come into contact with African people, the belief that dark skin or blackness was reviled by early Europe is misleading. So this idea that Europeans saw African people or saw dark-skinned people as ugly or as evil or as less than human is absolutely false, right? Because even if you go back to many of our earlier lectures, we talked about how many Europeans came to Africa to learn. Many times they saw these people as superior, as leaders. Why? Because they understood that the oldest and the greatest civilization was in Egypt. And they understood, at least these people did. Now we try to say that they were aliens or that they were Middle Eastern or whatever. But at this time, they knew, oh, these people were black people, were dark-skinned people. If you look at some of the early images or early paintings, even in many European museums now, early images of Jesus and Moses and all of that are darker-skinned people. So this idea that there was this racism that occurred when they were coming into contact with us on the continent is misleading. And in many ways, African people were ascended, and many times they were even deified. They were looked at as being gods because of their strength, because of their knowledge, because of their history and their civilization for so long. And although Arabs enslaved, we talked about that as well, the Arab slave trade. I know you mentioned that last time as well, that blacks and whites, black people were given the most menial tasks. So even during the Arab slave trade, right, the Arab slave trade was not, in some ways, was not solely linked to Arabs enslaving African people, but they also enslaved white folks as well, right? However, there was this hierarchy of who had the worst task, and oftentimes African people, black people, had the worst task. So again, you start to see how a lot of the evolution began to change in terms of going from just not liking a person based on their religion, not liking a person because you saw them as barbaric, to now seeing certain people as less than, as naturally evil. This kind of goes to what you were asking earlier about looking at an early map of what Africa looked like prior to the slave trade. And as you can see, you have all of these, and this is probably as close as we could get. I'm sure you could even break this down even more to where at every small shape, every kind of circle, semicircle, square was a different group of people, right? These are all various types of people, as what you were talking about, ethnicities, and all of these people had different what? Languages, religions, cultures, societies, governments. And so to come to one and think that you can just come in and try to enslave these people, and these people may speak two different languages and have two different customs. So it's almost impossible to enslave all of these people if you look at them as how they looked at each other, which was like this. This is the way in which many pre-colonial Africans looked at. This is how different they were. Yes. Oh, I thought you had your hand up. Oh, sorry. Okay.
What's going on up in the north?
Right. So this is sub-Saharan. So when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, much of the slave trade had to do with the sub-Saharan. So they were coming here, much of central, and then sometimes they would cross. What is that? The Cape of not Cape of Good Hope. I forget the Cape. They all compete.
But didn't the population and the tribal area didn't extend all the way to the north, or is that just a map of where the slave trade worked? Because the whole northern map is empty. Is that north of that map is empty? Is that because it's a desert, or it wasn't?
No. So I mean, yes, of course, this is Sahara Desert. But you still had Africa. You still had African countries of people, and a lot of the interactions between these people were for sure between the Arab slave trade, Middle Eastern as well. Yes.
All right, I want to say that I believe, as Professor Fox said, the entirety of Africa belongs to Africa. And the African continent sits on a plate. It's one of the 7 tectonic plates. Israel sits on that same plate. Now, black people that transferred the entire continent for eons and eons, following the water out. The Zulu went down the bottom of something who said it began to be very tough, maybe northwest. But they followed water waves from the white Nile to the blue Nile. And so this history just upside down in every century. We can give it a bad thing. And I want to say something earlier, and I'm going to let it go. I used to also serve in public schools. And I found that black teachers primarily were afraid to teach just simple black history. It was just something that you just put a few people up on the wall. It's black history, goodbye. It wasn't anything sustained or academic. And it wasn't encouraged by the school. Not a curriculum part of it. They had books, but nobody was on it. There was the white teachers at Andrew Jackson, I know one teacher, who made the black students read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. The black teachers were totally unconcerned. And the children didn't want to read it. They did not want to read the autobiography. That we're made to do this. So that's the attitude. And that's why we're so far behind. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Yes, sir. Also, one of the slave trades we also wanted to talk about was the Arab slave trade. And so the Arab slave trade is one that is oftentimes forgotten, particularly in East Africa. So when you were asking about North Africa and East Africa, and so a lot of that was the Arab slave trade, and obviously we know as well because there was a very strong Arab influence in West Africa as well. So into Western Africa, and sometimes the Arabs from the north who were Muslim enslaved Africans in the south who were also Muslims, thereby violating one of the basic customs of their faith that no Muslim should enslave another Muslim. And so I just want to have us watch this quick video on this topic that talks a little bit about the Arab slave trade.
In Africa itself, that was a great event that has been forgotten. Concurrent with the slave trade, almost at the same time it began, in inner Africa, the last of the great African nation states had not died. Sangay still existed and would exist up until 1591, when it was invaded by Morocco. The Arab influence came from East Africa, from the island of Zanzibar. Now, the Arab influence came from what is now Kuwait, Oman. These East African Arabs, these southern Western Asian Arabs, turned Zanzibar into one of the largest slave trading ports in history. You want to know, where did these slaves go? Some of them went to Asia. Some of them were traded with the Portuguese. But the Arabs, at a given time, took up to 30, 40 million Africans out of Africa. The Arabs. Yeah, and except for the energy and the manpower and the organization that the Arabs and the Arab slave trade drained out of Africa, Africa would have had enough energy and organization to resist the European slave trade. The Arab slave trade was one of the great tragedies in the history of Africa. And it is a tragedy equal to, if not surpassing, the European slave trade. When the Iranians who invaded India took over, they did not trust indigenous armies. So they began to use Africans as mercenary soldiers. And some of these soldiers were slaves. Some of them were just paid soldiers. Some of these Africans rose to high positions in the armies of India. Some of them were great generals. In fact, the river Ganges is named after an African general. That's not even an Indian name. That was an Indian named Malachi who became governor of Bengal. This is outlined so beautifully in a little book by Joseph Harris, former professor of history at Howard University, former head of the history department, called The African Presence in Asia. That's another unexplored aspect of Africa. And if you want to know the history of the Arab slave trade, that you should study UNESCO documents 2, part of the many documents attendant to the rewriting of the history of Africa. And it gives you the documents dealing with slave trade in the Indian Ocean. Now, if you study the Nigerian woman, Madam Tenable, who was in the trade for local consumption, when she discovered that the people that she was capturing and using for local consumption were being taken out of Africa, not returned, she began a war on the trade.
So, did you hear what he said about the Arab slave trade and its effects on the transatlantic slave trade? What did he say? Had it not been for that, Africans probably wouldn't have the manpower to be able to resist the European slave trade had that one had not taken out about 30 or 40 million African people out of the continent. So that is why it is important for us to, we've talked about it before, but I also just kind of wanted to mention it again as we go into the transatlantic slave trade. And another thing I wanted to say, and he talked about once many African people started to realize the type of slavery and the chattel slavery that was happening, there was resistance by some of those leaders.
I did want to make a comment on Dr. Clark's comments. So Dr. Clark pointed out that maybe 30 to 40 million Africans were taken out of the continent based upon the Arab slave trade. Yes, that's true. Then almost 3 times as many more didn't make it out that were captured. So we have to figure out what happened to them. And that's because the Arab slave trade was primarily concerned with getting massive amounts of African people that were being captured to move ivory tusks from the interior of Africa to the coast. We're talking about 1,000-mile trek. So most of the Africans, perished by the time they reached shore. That's one area. And the other area was taking mostly women and children for the pedophile trade. Now, people don't really want to demonstrate like that, but that's the case. So most of the men regarded taken by the Arab slave trade were actually castrated. So you see, this is why we don't see necessarily a mass amount of African people in these Arab lands, because they never intended for black men to be part of the slave societies there, but more or less like being eunuchs, like that kind of situation, or moving the ivory tusks. And that was not the primary focus necessarily European slave trade, but not necessarily taking up the tusks, but really the movement of African people to these offshore colonies that Europeans had in the Western Hemisphere, for them to be able to set up production about sugar and rice and the tobacco and everything to, resell back to Europe. And that explains also the differences in the ships, the types of ships that the Arabs had. Arabs were closer in, so they had these smaller dhow vessels, and Europeans had to come from a longer distance with much greater size ships to transport Africans further and further away.
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead, Sam, you have a question.
So two questions in the map. One, which part of Africa had the slavery?
And what was your other question?
My other question was, did they have slavery in other continents except for Africa?
Wow. All right. Those are really, really good questions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, brother. So you said which parts of Africa was the slave trade? So the Arab slave trade happened in large parts of North Africa, East Africa, and some of West Africa. And then the transatlantic slave trade happened in West Africa, in other parts as well, mostly West Africa, Central Africa, and some of East Africa. So all of the African continents, to some degree, was influenced by or experienced some aspect of the slave trade, and all of the continent of Africa was affected by the slave trade. And then you asked, was there slavery on any other continents besides Africa? So yes, slavery was something that existed all over the world. In many parts, it was called indentured servitude, which means that you would work for people for a certain amount of time, and then after that, you would be free, right? But unfortunately, when it came to what we understand about the slave trade in Africa, that's not how it was. When Europeans came and when Arabs came and enslaved many people in Africa, once they were in slavery, they stayed for their entire lives. So it was a different type of slavery than what you saw in other continents. That's why it's considered to be so much more harsh. And some sources call it the African Holocaust, or they call it that. So those are really good questions, bro.
And yeah, and I want the young man asking those questions, but it wasn't just for the Africans that were being enslaved initially.
Mhm.
It was for several generations to come.
Yes, absolutely. So what you're talking about is the effects of slavery. It's not just for them, but because again, what we're talking about is we're talking about people that were taken out of these areas, out of these countries, and these weren't just commoners, right? And I don't want to downplay farmers, but they were taking essentially the best of the best, right? Out of the continent. They were taking doctors, they were taking soldiers, they were taking astronomers, teachers, professors, kings, right? Economists. They were taking the best of the best out of the continent. And so it left these people with a huge intellectual void as well, and an innovative void. They also took the youngest. So they would take the younger men and the younger women. So now all you have left is very, very small children or very, very older people, right? So again, that was another huge effect of the slave trade.
The last stronghold in Spain, right, where the Moors were fighting in Granada.
Mm-hmm.
Those Moors that were captured in Granada, which is the last stronghold, they were taken to Barbados.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the first slaves. It was just before the moment. They hadn't left until 92.
Mm-hmm.
All right, 1490 is the last stronghold in Spain of the Moors.
Mm-hmm.
They took them to Barbados.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so like it didn't matter where
Prior to the ones that came to Hispaniola.
Yeah, these were fighters. And bumming out the Moors, they literally not brick and stone built it, but mentally built it. These were the same people, just like you were saying about the intellectual people that they were taking.
Right.
They weren't taking no Rudy Pulo dudes who didn't know nothing,
Right.
walking like this. No, they were taking strong, stout soldiers.
Because even when you talk about the building of what we call the original 13 colonies, right? And Georgia was considered a buffer colony, right? The state of Georgia was a buffer colony, meaning Europeans sent their throwaway people to Georgia. They're prisoners. When their prisons became overcrowded, they said, well, listen, we're building this colony over in the Americas. We're just going to send our overly crowded prisoners over here, right? That's not what happened with the slave trade. They weren't just sending prisoners, like you said, they were sending the best of their people, right? And so that's what's important for us to know about the slave trade. African slavery dates back to the beginnings of civilization. So we talked about that, and that the kingdoms of Asante, Dahomey, they were dedicated to the pursuit of power and money, and would traffic in slavery on an unprecedented scale. So now we're going to talk about some of the ways in which African kings, African queens, and some of these leaders participated in the slave trade. So Asante and Dahomey were organized, and they had these very strong militaries, and they pursued the accumulation of wealth through gold, guns, and slavery. And so essentially what happened is in the 17th century, the Asante people stopped exchanging gold for slaves because they wanted to reestablish control over the prices of gold. And so because they wanted to establish that, Asante began to go into colonial wars with many of their neighbors. The Asante victories resulted in a large internal slave class, but the Asante people no longer needed to buy slaves, and they had more than they could control. And so with this situation, it coincided with the New World wanting to have more control or wanting to have more slave labor. And so the Europeans and the Asante struck a deal. And what they did was they started to give the Asante people gold and guns, and in exchange, they would give them slaves from the Dahomey kingdom. And so that was how, and so essentially, instead of doing direct trade with the Dahomey people or other people, essentially Europeans became the middlemen. And as Europeans became the middlemen, what you're going to end up seeing happening is instead of African people, even when they were trading humans with each other, they allowed for Europeans and they allowed for white folks to become the middlemen. And now they're getting paid. Europeans started getting paid on the front end and on the back end, right? Now they're taking slaves from one place, from one African kingdom, taking it to another African kingdom, and they're getting slaves and they're trading in Dahomey, and they're taking those enslaved people to Asante and then getting paid again, and then coming over to the Americas and then trading again, right? And so that is how, and they're doing this for centuries and centuries and centuries, and that is how essentially Europeans became as wealthy as they are today. So I just wanted us to kind of see that from an economic perspective.
Explain the Dahomey people. Explain that.
Oh, so the Dahomey civilization, probably the most recent connection we know of the Dahomey civilization is the Woman King. Y'all seen that movie?
Yeah.
The Woman King with Viola Davis.
Yeah.
So that was a display of the African warriors, the woman warriors that helped to protect the Dahomey people from not only other African neighbors that tried to attack them, but also European slave traders as well. So that was the Dahomey people. Yes, ma'am. So a lot of the gold, so we talked about this with when we went over Ghana, Mali, and Songhai in the last class. So when the Europeans were coming to trade gold with the Dahomey people, they're getting this gold. A lot of them are getting this gold from Europeans who were trading with Ghana, with Mali, and with Songhai, who actually had, I think Ghana had control of the world's gold, of the largest gold trade in the world at that time. This was centuries and centuries before this, but this is how gold was becoming part of the economic circulation through, and this was, I think it was like the 1200s, maybe 11 or 1200s before. Yes.
But not all gold came from Europe.
No.
Ghana had gold mines.
Yeah, Ghana had gold mines, salt mines. There were also gold mines, I believe, in the Middle East. Timbuktu. Well, that's where Ghana was, right? What we know is Mali now, but Timbuktu was there as well.
So the continent was being robbed of its treasures.
Absolutely.
It's gold, it's jewels, it's titanium, it's rubber.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Especially now.
essentially that.
The Americans.
But there were gold mines all over in various places all over the world, for sure.
Yeah, I want to point out too, should I probably heard this term called Ruga Ruga. Ruga Ruga was a name that was used for African mercenaries who went underneath the banner of Islam, working for Arabs and Arab concerns, where they would go in and burn down villages and everything and work to capture African people in various ways. They were in various cells and the like in different places on the continent. And I bring them up because it's interesting if people go and see right now today, why do you have groups, in the northern part of Nigeria that are Muslim, that are creating havoc in Nigeria? You got outbreaks in Mozambique, and you got Al-Shabaab and places like Somalia. These are all remnants of these Ruga groups that remained in these countries that were working on behalf of Arabs a long time ago, and they had just resurfaced it. So right before Europeans colonized the continent in the 1880s, roughly, one of the things that they wanted to do was to stop the Arab slave trade, which was at its highest peak in the 1860s, after slavery had ended in the United States, after it had ended in Europe for about 25 years or 30 years. At that time, one of the things that the Europeans wanted to do was to get Arabs out of places like the Congo. There's a great book called The Fall of the Congo Arabs. It drained the continent of these Arabs in Tanzania, in the Congo, so that they could come in with the 3 C's: capitalism, Christianity, and civilization. And so they were invested in these areas. And that is one of the reasons that the Arabs are so mad at Europeans, because Europeans diced into the Arab slave trade and cut off Arabs from the slave trade, which they were making a whole lot of money. And Britain was sending ships in the 1890s to curtail the Arab slave trade in these areas that you were talking about, down in Mozambique and all the way up the East Coast. And the Arabs never forgave Europeans for cutting into the slave trade, because at that time, we're talking about a mass amount of ivory tusks being taken out as part of the whole thing. In fact, great articles, everybody can look them up. The piano trade, the piano industry in Europe and the United States burgeoned around the 1890s with the slave trade of Arabs, primarily of bringing the ivory tusk out. That was the basis of the piano industry, of using the piano keys along with billiards were made out of ivory. So it's all connected up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jameer, you had your hand raised or no? Did you have your hand raised? Okay. Yeah.
So two questions again. One, what did they mean slaves for? And two, who did they trade for slaves?
So, first question, to answer your question, what did they need these enslaved people for? They were used for agricultural purposes, to do farming. They were used to work the fields. They were used to build these other places, particularly in America. They were essentially used for everything. To build America, to help shape the country that you live in now. Much of what you see, especially larger institutions, colleges, even the White House was built by people who were considered to be slaves. And then you said, what were they traded for? They were traded for things like gold. They were traded for sugar, for rice, for guns, right? Mirrors, cloth, like silk, right? All of these things were used as parts of trade for these people who were considered to be slaves. All right, we're going to wrap up in a little bit, but one of the things I wanted to talk about when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade are the slave fortresses, right? And the slave fortresses, some of the ones we may know if you ever visited Sierra Leone or Ghana or many different parts of West Africa. Many different slave fortresses still exist even today. The construction in 1482 of a fort at Elmina was Europe's first toehold in Africa. And these forts were built to protect, quote unquote, the interests along the coast of West Africa. When we say interests, obviously we mean these enslaved people that were being kidnapped and brought into these fortresses and then were used as holding places for the ships that would eventually come and take us over into what would be considered the New World. The Portuguese were also the first people to exploit African people as enslaved people. So when we talk about the slave trade, it actually started with the Portuguese. They were among the first to get here to come to Africa and exploit these people. And then eventually other groups started to become a part of the slave trade as well. The Asante sold strangers, foreigners, enemies, and captives. So again, these people were not necessarily selling their quote unquote own people. Again, people they didn't know, people that were not part of their own groups, people that they had been fighting with for centuries, or prisoners. These were the people that they were selling off in the slave trade. I'm going to get to brother in a second. They leased the land to Europeans, which was used for the purpose of building forts. So again, one of the things that they talk about, and if you grab one of the pieces, you know, I always print out literature for you to take with you. And one of the things that they talk about in the literature that I printed out, so you can take that on your way out, is how African people were very open people, right? As a people, we've always been very accepting. Even when we look at nowadays, when people talk about the cookout, who's invited to the cookout, and if a person is nice, or if a person can do this or do that, and they're invited to the cookout. And that same idea existed even then. Oftentimes, African people didn't necessarily see their land as just belonging to them, but it was God's land. And anybody who came with perceivably good intentions could access that land. And so African people allowed Europeans to come, allowed them to build churches, allowed them to build schools, allowed them to lease land, thinking that they had good intentions, never considering what some people may consider inherently evil nature of who they were at that time to actually set up and then begin to take over their countries, take over their civilizations, take over their people. So they leased this land to the Europeans, and when they leased that land to them, they used that land to help build these fortresses. And these fortresses were then used as slave fortresses for those same African people. The Kabeto were the women warriors of the homie, you were asking earlier, and they fought as a military unit and served as bodyguards to the king, to help eventually fight off the European slavers. I thought I saw a hand. Did I saw it? Oh, yes.
Yeah, maybe another bullet point should be that, and I have to say this, I put the evil Catholic Church.
Evil, you said evil Catholic Church.
But the evil Catholic Church, through paper bulls and dictators, they conspired with the East Arabs in the Portuguese slavery. They conspired with them through papal bulls and edicts saying that Africans were not considered evil and also uncivilized. And so therefore that justifies putting them in.
Right.
So people should remember that about the Catholic Church.
And I think it's also important for us to understand too that initially I kind of skipped this part on you reminded me about this. Initially we talked about how the original contact with the Africans was not this idea that they were subhuman. It wasn't this idea that they were again, many of them were deified, but the whole purpose of the slave trade was not based on racism, it was based on capital. It was based on money, right? It was economic. And then to justify, right, the use of this specific people, now we're going to create this whole concept and this construct of race. And along with that, you have this notion of the papal bull and this idea that these people were subhuman. These people were uncivilized. These people have no history. These people have no culture. All of that and those racist ideas were used to justify the economic prospects of the usage of African people for the building up of what would be considered the new world. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned earlier about the contact of maybe early Europeans with African people. Maybe I'll highlight the Romans. Early on with Ethiopia and other places. But I think it's interesting to know, maybe this is for another time, to deal with narratives about the story of Noah and Ham and the supposed inferiority of African people based upon interpretations or misinterpretations of the Bible. But I wanted to point out, maybe this is something we get into later, that the conventional Bible that we know now seemingly wasn't put together until the 1500s. So now we're talking about an actual book. But before then, when the Romans and stuff met African people, there was no Bible. Right. There was no Rome itself wasn't even Catholic or Cathos. So we're talking about different eras in time, but basically the translation about African people being evil, being subhuman, being cursed by God as an extension of the deed of Ham was not put together until the 1500s.
Right, it was a post-racial.
Yeah, but all three of the Abrahamic faith scholars, Jews, Arabs, and the Romans, who had the same core ideas about the Old Testament, all agreed amongst themselves that African people would be the hewers of wood and drawers of water for all people that battle together about who would be the head of being Caucasian, Jews, Romans, and Arabs. And I think that needs to be dealt with, in some other time.
Absolutely. To talk a little bit more about the African involvement in the slave trade, there was an estimation of, and again, we heard 10 to 12 million. Dr. Clark said that it was about 30 to 40 million. Some sources say that the total human loss to Africa over the 4 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade ranged from 30 million to 200 million, right? So we really don't know how vast the numbers are, right? But the vast majority of enslaved of African people that were taken out of Africa and were sold were, again, there were rulers, traders, military, aristocracy, right, who all grew wealthy from the business of African slavery and of the transatlantic slave trade. Let me see. There was an African woman who was about 13 years old when she was kidnapped in 1770 in what is considered today's Ghana. Had no doubt the shared responsibility of Africans from the business. She referred to this in, this is a brother, referred to this in his own capture after he regained his freedom. He said this. He said, "I must owe to the shame of my own countrymen that I was first kidnapped and betrayed by some of my own complexion who were the first cause of my exile and slavery. But," he added, "if there were no buyers, there would be no sellers." If there were no buyers, there would be no sellers. Right? So again, we have to talk about everybody's involvement. But had there not been these captors, had there not been this system put in place in the beginning, there would not be these people who would have fell prey. Right? So it's very important that that we mention that. Where African enslaved people came from, again, this is just a quick map. The number of enslaved Africans forced to embark onto Europe, as you can see, most of them came out of right here, out of West and Central Africa, about 3 million. And then right here where we're talking about a lot of West Africa, about 2.5 million. and then other parts of Africa, about 2.3 million, and then in other areas. But as you can see, most of it right here along the western coast, right, is where many African people and the transatlantic slave trade were brought. And as you were talking about, the Arab slave trade right along North Africa and right along here.
10 years ago, just one point. 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, the University of Florida had an exhibit at the Harn Museum. And the title of the exhibit they had was called Congo Across the Water. Congo spelled with a K, not with a C. It's just where Dr. Grant had pointed out about the West Central Africa. And so the University of Florida's researchers had gotten together with a library, I believe, in Belgium. They put together a collective work called Congo Across the Water. And one may be thinking about, well, wait a minute, Congo across the water. Yeah, I'm looking at the Congo Kingdom that comprised today's DRC, the Republic of Congo, Angola, and Gabon, those four countries. And one may think that we're talking about over there, but no, the book Congo Across the Water was talking about the tapestry of that Congo area, everything in the United States, about all that is tapestry in the United States. In fact, Louis Armstrong, trumpeter, went to Congo to give credit to jazz itself, the polyrhythms of jazz, and starting from the Congo. And I bring those things up because that was certainly a massive area that African people were taken from, spread out all over the Western Hemisphere from this Congo area. And it's a great book. It's probably about 500 pages, but it does document, massively African people being brought from that West Central area, more massively than some of the other places over time. In fact, if you look at South Carolina, South Carolina alone, for 200 years, 75% of the people brought to South Carolina were brought from that area. Hence, when we say Golden Geese, it's really golden, ungolden, golden geese. That's what it is. We have to deal with the Bantu heritage people here.
Absolutely. Thank you. One last question for you.
So, going back to the other map, was the colorful circles where people to take slaves?
Yes. So if you go back to this is where many of these enslaved African people were taken from, right? And so where the color is where these specific people were taken.
What does fight mean?
Right? The Bible. Yeah.
Pardon me?
Right of Benin, the country of Benin.
But fight means, I guess means.
I don't know, but but like most of those countries have since, and I said since recently, apologized for their participation in the transatlantic slave trade, especially Ghana.
Yeah.
They offered an official apology in 2019 and welcomed the diaspora back.
Yeah. So there's definitely been a tradition of that, especially more recently. And when they're saying that, they're just talking about this as an area, because a lot of this has changed, especially with the colonization. So a lot of these areas are a lot smaller now. So this is just an area where at the time it was called Benin, which is a lot smaller than this area. So we're almost done for today, but I did want to at least end on some of the thoughts around the Holocaust of the slave trade before we actually get into depictions of slavery, and then we're gonna go into like the reconstruction of Ma'af and all of that on our at the next time that we talk about this topic, which will be the third Saturday in December. But just a couple of things that actually, again, you can see on the piece that you'll be able to take with you. One of the things is that, again, African people made the mistake of letting Europeans settle their internal family disputes. We talk about that even now, right? If you got beef with your brother or sister or your cousins, we can fight among each other. But you can't talk about my brother, you can't talk about my sister, you can't come and try to fight my cousins because all of us is coming. We teach our nieces and nephews, my daughter, y'all can fight amongst each other all the time at home, but if we send you outside, ain't nobody messing with nobody, right? We had learned that lesson then, right? We can fight amongst each other, but Europeans had come and they capitalized on that. They capitalized on those internal disputes between Asante and Dahomey, right? Between these kingdoms. The foreigner turned us one against the other, conquered us both, and this is the great mistake we made in the 15th and 16th centuries. By the time we had caught on, they were already so massive. The slave trade was already such an important part of the West African economy. Even people that wanted to stop, they couldn't, because it was such a key part of the economy. And even in order for us to fight the Europeans off as well, we still needed their guns, their resources, the things that they had already built, because they had spent 2 centuries capitalizing off of the issues that we have with each other. So that's a very important part. As a people, we have always been hospitable to strangers. The weakness in this noble gesture is that we have not been alert enough and suspicious enough to examine the intentions of strangers that we have invited into our homes. One of the things I learned when I was in grad school studying this was even the notions of the devil, even notions of Satan. We hadn't even recognized what that meant as African people until the European slave trade. Once the European slave trade came and we recognized the depth of evil and the depth of inhumanity that exists, that expanded our notion of what evil was, of what the devil was. So there was a whole paper that I wrote on that topic. That was so long ago, I can't remember, but that just goes to show that even now, which is why many people, particularly people of African descent, are very careful and are very secure and almost I don't want to say reject other groups, but are very careful about allowing strangers into certain places and spaces of African descent, because this was part of the ways in which Europeans were able to come in and be successful in the slave trade. Europeans did not visit the coast of West Africa looking for slaves. They were searching for a route to Asia for the spices, and they heard about, and they needed something to supplement the dull European food of that day. And so, again, there was trade with sugar, with spices, with salt, etc. The creation of the plantation system in the Americas and the Caribbean islands also set in motion the way of life for Europeans. So the creation of the plantation system in Jamaica, in Haiti, and of course in the southern United States also set up this quote-unquote need for the slave labor. Had the European entered into a genuine partnership with the Africans instead of reducing them to slaves, there would have been more goods and services to be had, both for Europeans and the Africans through contract labor. And so essentially what the author is saying is, if there would have been a partnership as opposed to an exploitation of African people, there could have been a growth of both groups, of both Europeans and Africans. But essentially for the grabbing of greed and for the grabbing of power, we see that it happened the way that it did. Europeans were regaining their confidence, manifesting a new form of nationalism, and extending that nationalism into racism, which is what we talked about earlier. And we will never know how many actually truly died in the African Holocaust, in the African slave trade. Again, the numbers go from 10 million all the way up to 200 million. It could be even more. And at the very center of the slave trade was the dehumanization of African people. First, you have to see these people as inhuman, as not human or subhuman, and then that then justified the reasoning for using them as slave labor, as forced slave labor as using them for people who could be exploited and used to build up an entirely new dynasty of people. The slave trade started with the Europeans and began to expand into the broader world, and the market for slaves was created by Europeans for European reasons. And the story of the European slave trade in Africa is essentially the story of the consequences of the second rise of Europe in world history. So that kind of ends this part of the discussion, and then we'll go into when we were brought on the Middle Passage. And so that is what we talk about here when we go into how the Middle Passage was created, the experiences on the Middle Passage, and then eventually our lives in the West Indies, and then eventually the American South.
Dr. Brown, I know your talk is ending. I would like to thank you again for very insightful discussion.
Thank y'all for being here. Make sure to spread the word, tell people to come. And thank you for your feedback as well.
I want to just get your comment either right now or maybe for sometime later. Know that I referenced that learn more in an hour in the People's African History class, an hour, than maybe what could be offered for a year in public school. I want to know that in that word African, you have used the word African consistently and a lot in your presentation. Fine, great. But I wanted to ask you this then about that. I noticed that a number of movements have come up recently. I just want to name a few of them. The ADOS movement, the FBA movement, the Hebrew Israelite movement, the Native American movement, we were already here movement, the Moors, the Freedmen. All these different groups, most of them, state that, well, they're not from Africa, or that the slave trade didn't exist. The black people were already here, and the white people just found all these black people here. And these movements are growing on the internet, in which a number of black people are saying they're not even African anymore. So if you are labeling your program as the People's African History Classroom, and you're using the word African, what would you say is the plan for getting black people in the United States to identify themselves as African and be conscious of the history that you're talking about, because there's growing movements trying to tell the black people they're not African.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to respond to that as we wrap up. I do believe personally that we should identify as African. I do think that we, people of African descent, people who are black, people, African Americans, African Europeans, I think that is an important identity and distinction that we should make out for myself. Do consider myself as African American, Black American, etc. I try not to instill my personal ideas onto people and allow people to kind of evolve and think for themselves. And I just kind of present what the history says and what the book says, and then people then identify, like you said, some people identify as ignorance or Moors or Bantu people or Alkebulanites or something of that nature. And so I try not to get too much into people's personal, beliefs and how people want to personally identify. But I personally do believe that it is very important that we identify and link ourselves, as Marcus Garvey said, and look at Africa as our ancestral and our spiritual homeland. So that is something that is absolutely important to me, which is why when I created this program, I put it at the center of it. If somebody else want to create another program at another class and they want to call it ADOS history class, cool. But this is
they are teaching wrong history. They're teaching wrong history, and they're teaching stuff that in some cases are lies. They're teaching, some of these groups are teaching that the slave trade did not exist, and that Europeans did not bring African people over here on ships, and they're Africa, they were already here to take it.
And see, that's just historic, and that doesn't even, that's not even individual, that's just historical law. Exactly.
I have a cousin.
Go ahead, I'm gonna take you, and then I'm gonna end with you. Go ahead.
I have a cousin that does that. And what I did was I got him some books.
Yeah.
I told him, keep reading. That's what he found out. He found out, he called me and he said, man, you were right. But you know about me being right.
Yeah, I mean, it's not true.
We got Saint Leon, we got, Ivan Van Serta, all these people they got PhDs. You can they already did their scholarship. You can see that yes, there were people here with Columbus Day that were black. And we found out that these pre-Columbian blacks that were here, they came from somewhere thousands of years ago before they were here, and it was Africa.
Yeah.
So all they got to do is they keep reading.
That's right.
That's all they got to do is
Keep reading.
it's okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I agree with you that not all teachers are qualified to teach Black history. And so we in America have been so brainwashed and stereotyped, most of us cannot make the connection with that. I have done my genealogy, and so my people came from Gabon. So I'm part of the Bantu tribe. But even before I knew that, and I have percentages of everybody in my bloodline, including you, and of course we all know what happened on the plantation. But know yourself. Know yourself above all things. And that's deep work that you have to do for you. And it should be done by you. And I hope that after this class, or the classes, that we will do our own research.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why I always try to provide references, books, articles, information, because I don't want you to just take my word for any of these. I want you to go do your own research, go on your own journey, go on your own study. Very similar to what the professor said as well. And then, and as you continue to read, like my brother Smurf said, Ryan, my bad, I know Smurf. Ryan said, as you begin to read and know and understand truth in these books, and you go to these sources, you go to our elders, Chance Dia, Ivan Van Serta, W.E.B. Du Bois, all of our brothers and sisters who've done this research and who know this stuff, Francis Cress Wilson, you'll start to see where the truth will begin to be uncovered, and it's undeniable, right? Even the Honorable Elijah Muhammad talks about, you give a brother a glass of water, a glass of clean water, and a glass of dirty water, and again, you let the clean water, you let the light, you let the truth speak for itself. You don't have to push it, you don't have to force it, right? And so we just continue to provide truth and light. I saw your hand, Russell.
I was just going to say a lot of times history becomes, or we search for history to come. And so when individuals hear things that align with their immediate thought process, they have a tendency to gravitate towards it. But one thing that I've learned even in ministry is that truth always has a cosign.
Yeah.
So it's not only going to be in one place. And I think that's where the reading and the research comes in, is you begin to find those same things in other places and other aspects of research.
Yeah.
And it cosigns the initial thought.
Yeah.
And if you can't find a cosign, the credit's not good.
Right.
Absolutely. So yes, no references. We'll continue this talk. Next first Saturday we'll have a guest lecturer, Dr. Haynes. Outside we'll come in and talk about race, and then we'll continue on this historical path. Again, if you want to donate, feel free to scan the Cash App and donate. Flyers there, some literature there. Make sure you sign the sign-in sheet before you leave. And thank you all so much for being here. Oh, and also make sure you follow us on YouTube. So if you can't be here, we're always live as well. So if you can't be here, make sure you go to our YouTube and subscribe so you can see what we're going live if you can't make it in person. Thank you.
You're welcome. And that's
Thank you so much. I know you were playing with this. I appreciate Thank you so much. Okay, all right. I'm going to see right now. Get them out of here. Yeah,
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.